So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Floyd. I'm here today to moderate this panel on Atlantic maritime security. First, on behalf of all four of us, we want to thank the Navy League for bringing us all together today to discuss this critical topic in U.S. national security. And a special thanks to Ms. Joya Simpson and her colleagues who have been doing so much work behind the scenes throughout this week. So many thanks. But most importantly, thank you to all of you. After a long day, hopefully you've enjoyed the panels. And you are now here to hear our wonderful panel's thoughts on these topics and engage in what will hopefully be a lively Q&A at the end of this session. Atlantic maritime security is a broad topic. And sadly, I think for many of us, it may seem to fall by the wayside compared to more high visibility areas of responsibility in the world, seemingly more pressing issues. But the Atlantic Basin is of vital importance, and that is why we're all here today. It includes several of the world's largest economies, dynamic developing states, vital trade routes, critical mineral resources, rich fishing reserves. Yet the region also faces a host of varied threats and challenges: illicit maritime trafficking, illegal, unreported and unregistered IUU fishing, a topic we will look at. These challenge effective maritime governance throughout the region. At the same time, increased Russian, Chinese, military, diplomatic, and economic engagement throughout the region also pose challenges for U.S. foreign policy. So today, with their respective experience in maritime operations, the intelligence community, and private industry, our three panelists each bring a unique perspective and unique lens to view these challenges and discuss these opportunities. So first, we have Vice Admiral Stephen Poulin, who currently serves as the Atlantic Area Commander for the United States Coast Guard. In this role, Vice Admiral Poulin serves as the operational commander for all Coast Guard missions stretching all the way from the Rocky Mountains to the Arabian Gulf. He's also dual-hatted as the commander of Coast Guard Defense Forces East, which provides mission support to the DoD and combatant commanders. He previously served as the Southcom Director of Operations. And of interest, Vice Admiral Poulin is also an attorney with a JD and an LLM in environmental law. Don't hold that against him. But he served as the Judge Advocate General and Chief Counsel of the Coast Guard and completed a tour as the Chief of the Office of Maritime and International Law. So again, all of these experiences hopefully will come to bear in our discussion today. Mr. Liston Lee, our second panelist today, served for 38 years in the intelligence community and just 5 days ago retired from the Defense Intelligence Senior Level Federal Service. So congratulations to Mr. Lee on his retirement last Friday. In his final assignment, Mr. Lee served as the Principal Advisor to the Director of the National Maritime Intelligence Integration Office, or NIMIO. He represented the Director of National Intelligence on maritime issues, working to advance maritime intelligence integration, information sharing, and national level maritime domain awareness. In his previous tours, Mr. Lee supported efforts to improve analytic tradecraft at ODNI. He served as the senior briefer to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during a tour at DIA, and was also the first U.S. deputy to the NATO Intelligence Board. Again, varied experiences in the intelligence community that will shed some great light on our topics today. And finally, Mr. Alan Gardner is the Chief Technology Officer at Sky Dweller Aero, where he has supported efforts to develop large solar-powered aircraft for defense and commercial industries. He previously worked as the chief architect for special programs at Northrop Grumman, where he provided technical direction for the design and development of advanced autonomous aircraft, and also worked as the chief engineer for AME Unmanned Air Systems, a small unmanned aircraft company that delivered over 3,000 UAVs to UK and US Special Forces, and was ultimately acquired by Lockheed Martin. He holds a BS in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and a Master's of Science in Aeronautical Engineering. With those introductions done, I'll now turn the floor over to our three panelists to set the stage for some brief introductory remarks and a few slides to set the stage for our discussion of Atlantic maritime security as a whole. We'll then proceed to a moderated discussion where we look at those high-level issues and start narrowing down onto issues such as illegal, unregistered, and unregulated fishing, the role of maritime domain awareness, emerging technologies, and global strategic competition. So with that, I will turn it to Vice Admiral Poulin for his initial remarks.
Well, thank you, Steve, and let me also start by thanking the Navy League and everybody who put Sea Air Space together. It's great to be here, and I really consider it a distinct privilege to serve on a panel with such other distinguished guests. So I look forward to the discussion and the dialogue, and hopefully your questions. I've got a slide here. I know it's probably somewhat of an eye chart. I apologize for that. What I wanted to reflect in showing you this is that your United States Coast Guard is globally connected. As the Commandant said this morning, the demand for the Coast Guard around the globe has never been higher. I've been commissioned for almost 40 years. I'll hit 38 years this spring, and I will tell you, I have never seen the Coast Guard more in demand nor more globally connected. And I'll talk about that in a second. And in some respects, the term Coast Guard is a bit of a misnomer, because when people think of the Coast Guard, they think of simply a coastal constabulary force. We are that, but we are also at all times a military force and the United States' maritime governance force. And as I will talk about, there is a particular set of authorities, capabilities, and access that we bring that is unique for the United States government. So I thought maybe the best way to just offer some introductory remarks was to go around the horn, if you will, of the Atlantic area of responsibility and talk just briefly about what we're doing and what I see as the security interest. Let me start with our domestic responsibilities. Those will be our highest priorities. They are and they will remain our highest priority. We will continue to maximize our ability to secure the marine transportation system. Global maritime commerce is the lifeblood of the global economy. More than 90% of goods that are sold here in the United States are transported by sea. And so we understand the importance to our national security, our economic prosperity of securing the marine transportation system. If the marine transportation system is safe, secure, and environmentally sound, economic prosperity follows. So we will be all in on ensuring that we do all that we can to protect America's vital natural resources. We protect America from threats that emanate from the southern border and approaches, and also protect our marine transportation system. Let me also mention one of our international programs as I start talking maybe in specific regional aspects what we're doing. We have an international port security program that was started after 9/11. It was legislatively mandated, and it was also codified through the International Maritime Organization. It's called our International Port Security Program. And these are teams that go out and visit ports around the world to do an assessment of their port security. And if a particular port is not maintaining effective anti-terrorism measures, then we can put conditions on entry for ports that enter the United States from those locations. Frankly, this has been a very successful program that I think has elevated maritime security across the globe. And we also offer ourselves up to be assessed from our international partners. We believe that international port security has to be a collaborative effort. And the good news is we start, all of us, with a shared goal of open and free and safe commerce. So let me go regionally, if I could. Let me go up to the Arctic first. I want people to understand that we have a continuity of interest across the Arctic. When we think of the Arctic, oftentimes we think of our United States extended continental shelf off Alaska, and it's important. And that is an area where we have to protect and preserve United States sovereignty and sovereign rights as an Arctic nation. But there's a continuity of interest that extends all the way over into the Atlantic, because when you look at man-made activity, increased maritime commerce, that will affect East Coast ports. Migrating fish stocks that may be moving north from what are now colder climates off New England and the Mid-Atlantic basin will become a vital source of protein for a global community that is looking for more protein over time with growing populations. And as our Vice Commandant said, Admiral Fagan earlier in the Arctic panel, what we bring to Arctic governance is access, we bring capability, and we bring partnerships. And that's what we're trying to do in the Atlantic Arctic. But we do that in a way that closely collaborates with key strategic allies like Canada, Denmark, the UK, and France. We run regular and recurring exercises in the Atlantic Arctic to ensure that we have the interoperability, the shared TTP, and that we have a shared presence to ensure maritime governance. Let me move over to Europe. The security environment in Europe has changed. We don't know what that fully means yet, but it has changed. I believe with that change will come a growing demand for the United States Coast Guard as well. First, most of our Arctic partners are in the Atlantic. And so we have to maintain strong relations with our European neighbors. But secondly, as I look around at what we've done recently in putting cutters and subject matter experts engaging with emerging nations in the Atlantic Basin, I can see that there is a growing thirst for the Coast Guard in certain parts of Europe, especially in the Mediterranean. We have delivered 4 fast response cutters to Bahrain. The final 2 will be delivered this summer. And as those vessels transit to Bahrain through the Mediterranean, we make sure that we have strategic engagements with committed partners, whether it's Greece, Malta, Italy. We've done engagements with Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Algeria, Tunisia. There is an interconnectedness between Mediterranean security and Atlantic security, and we want to be able to do our part there as well. And let me move down to Africa. Africa is an important region for us because of economic security, illegal fisheries, and there's a level and a growing level of armed piracy and armed robbery at sea, especially in the Gulf of Guinea. We have periodically conducted engagements with Gulf of Guinea partners. Those have not been as frequent as any of us would have hoped. They tend to be episodic at best. But now, as you've seen in the FY23 budget, we're launching an Atlantic Basin initiative and an Atlantic Basin partnership that I think will see us with increased and more persistent engagement with African partners. It will also hopefully allow us to get further into the Gulf of Guinea. Oftentimes, our engagements are with countries where we have bilateral relations up in the northern part of Western Africa, but this will allow us to get further into the Gulf of Guinea, and I'm excited about what our future looks like with our African partners. But having talked with many of our African partners, including last year at the International Sea Power Symposium, one of their greatest security challenges is illegal fishing, and we certainly will talk about that later. Let me move down to South America. I think having been the Director of Operations at U.S. Southern Command, I have kind of a unique perspective on our security relations with our South American partners. And I was very pleased that this past year we were able to take Coast Guard Cutter Stone on its post-shakedown cruise, and we were able to do some great engagements with our allies and partners like Brazil, Uruguay. Even we had some good engagement with Argentina. And we were able to talk about illegal fishing and what we can do together to address the threat of China's distant water fleet and certain encroachments into those vital fisheries in the southern Atlantic. And out of that came a growing dialogue with our Brazilian partners about how we can better collaborate in the Gulf of Guinea. Brazil, Portugal, France, the UK, Denmark, I've just been impressed with the level of international collaboration and the level of international willingness to work together to have a more cooperative approach to working with our African partners. And so there's another future that I'm very excited about. Let me move up to the Caribbean Basin. About 30 to 35% of narcotics flow comes through the Caribbean Basin into the United States. It's shifted over time between the Eastern Pacific. My point is that drug flow through the Caribbean Basin has and will continue to be a persistent threat to American neighborhoods. And we will remain fully committed to working with our partners and the international community to address the scourge of illegal narcotics. There's a vicious circle of threats that we see in the Caribbean where narcotics smuggling tends to fuel human smuggling, which tends to fuel a permissive environment that allows corruptive practices to take hold, which creates space for malign actors, both state and non-state actors. And so this is about taking poison off the streets of the United States, but it's also about attacking at its core the corruptive influences that cause destabilizing effects in a neighborhood that we share with so many countries who have the same values, familial ties as we do. So we're going to remain fully committed to the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere as well. So let me just pause there. I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot as we run around the horn on where our commitments are and what my focus is as the Atlantic Area Commander. Thanks, Steve.
Admiral Poland, thank you so much. I think that does a great job of showcasing precisely the varied challenges that exist in the Atlantic Basin and the multitude of players with whom we have to work to achieve these mission success. I know that also highlights a number of the themes that Mr. Lee would like to talk about today. So I'll pass the microphone over to Mr. Lee.
Steve, thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is really my honor and privilege to be here with you today at this wonderful Sea, Air, Space event. I mean, this is a great event, you know, particularly after the last 2 years. It's great to see a lot of old friends and reconnect in person. I have some very brief opening remarks using 3 slides, which I hope will frame my discussion today as well as elicit your questions. So slide 1 here, problems. I want to highlight that as I look at the many issues and threats facing the U.S. and our allies in the Atlantic Basin, I see climate change, illicit activity like IUUF, and great power competition as 3 key threats which we need to mitigate. Could we go to the next slide, please? Under activities, I then hope to discuss my recent experiences supporting efforts in the Atlantic Basin like EEZ mapping, counter illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and critical infrastructure protection. Next slide, please. And finally, I hope to elicit a discussion on solutions to these threats and issues. I believe it's critical that the U.S. government continue to highlight these problem areas through successful awareness campaigns in partnership with private industry. Also, that we continue efforts at developing meaningful, unclassified data sharing. And finally, a foot stop on the need for more partnerships between government, private sector, and foreign allies. And I'll tell you guys, the Coast Guard is leading the way in relation to partnerships in a global effort. So what I hope to accomplish is to frame some of these problems we face, talk about the progress I have witnessed, and discuss some broad solutions that I think would be helpful moving forward. Steve, that concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. And you do my job for me with a perfect segue into Mr. Gardner's opening remarks, highlighting the importance, as Mr. Lee does, of our partnerships with private industry to achieve these goals. So with that, Mr. Gardner, over to you.
Well, I'm honored to be here, especially with these gentlemen that have served many, many years for our country. And I hope that I can provide some perspective and some ideas from a technical perspective about how we might address some of these challenges. So our organization is focused on the challenge of persistent maritime domain awareness. And that's a particularly difficult technical challenge considering the large, extremely large area to cover, combined with the need to cover that area with high fidelity. high enough fidelity to perform target identification. And then add on the need to persist long enough to not just find an ID, but also track for long periods of time to support interdiction activities, which may extend over many, many hours. And so this is a particularly daunting challenge, and this is what we're really trying to target with what we're bringing forward as our solution to that, which is next slide, is the Skydweller platform. This is a photograph of the aircraft as it's flying over the Pacific Ocean, solar-powered aircraft. And this will be the first airborne platform capable of effectively unlimited range and endurance with heavy and powerful payloads. So this is tactical ISR grade payloads, not just like a GoPro camera. And the idea here is that you launch from existing air bases, travel thousands of miles to remote locations, and then persist overhead days, weeks, or months to perform maritime domain awareness, maritime patrol operations. Next slide. So as a maritime persistent patrol aircraft, we carry a suite of sensors, EOIR, radar, SIGINT, AS, all together so that we can perform the mission of detect, identification, and then track. And so the need here is to bring together all that capability, but then also have high bandwidth line of sight, beyond line of sight connectivity to coordinate with other ISR assets and interdiction assets in a theater of operations. So it's a big challenge. I think many of us that have been in this industry for years have kind of seen persistent ISR as kind of like the holy grail pursuit. We think we have a shot at it with this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner. I think we all in this room can agree, based on our varied experiences, that it would absolutely be a game changer if this type of technology can come to fruition. So thank you all three of our panelists for setting the stage for today's discussion. And I'd like to stay at the kind of strategic level, at the 30,000-foot level, for one quick round of follow-on questions based on your opening remarks before we delve into some of these specific challenges and thematic issues you've each identified. So I'll just keep working down the row here in the same order we just started. So Vice Admiral Poulin, I'll start with you. Specifically, I'd like to look at some of your comments on the Gulf of Guinea, and I think that will help elucidate some of our follow-on discussions about IUU fishing and the challenges there. But we're all aware the President's budget, proposed budget, was released last week, and earlier in the fiscal year, the U.S. Coast Guard released its FY23 budget. And in there, the stated desire of the Coast Guard, it says, quote, to increase U.S. Coast Guard presence in the Atlantic Basin by deploying additional assets to bolster capacity and grow capabilities to counter IUU fishing, illegal trafficking, and transnational organized crime, many of the issues and threats you spoke of, sir. I was wondering if specifically for the Gulf of Guinea, you could provide some additional detail on how the Coast Guard will achieve that goal, and what are some of the challenges that might arise as you seek to implement those goals? I think the Gulf of Guinea presents unique challenges compared to some of the other regions and partners you identified. What are some of the challenges you think might arise, and how will you overcome that?
No, that's a great question. We're very pleased, obviously, with the initiative in the FY23 budget. I think this is going to allow me to have that more persistent engagement with all of the Atlantic Basin, but in particular our African partners, to do something that we haven't been able to sustain just as we continue to make trade-offs, very difficult trade-offs between mission demand. We will still have that mission demand, we'll still have to make trade-offs, but this will give us a great shot in the arm to provide more persistent capability in Africa, and I'm excited about it. The focus will look across the mission spectrum. One of the things I didn't mention is that probably about 4 to 5% of narcotics flow leaves South America and ends up going to either Africa or Europe. So this isn't just about IUU. We recently did a law enforcement operation with Cabo Verde. It's not public yet, but I can tell you that it was a significant seizure of narcotics. And that just to me, reinforces that we have to be present there and we have to provide capability by, with, and through our partners. But a large part of it will be IUU. Our feeling is that if we can build capacity and train people on how to do effective fisheries boardings, then you can do an effective boarding for counter narcotics. You can do an effective boarding to ensure maritime governance, whatever the mission space is. I'm also very mindful that the Gulf of Guinea has a growing threat of piracy, armed robbery, as I mentioned before, and that's happening in an area where there is a growing expectation in the future of higher offshore energy production. So how do you ensure maritime security in an environment where you have persistent threats? The answer to that is partnerships, capabilities, and good maritime governance. And that's what we're trying to do.
That's great. Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Poole. And that leads into a topic that Mr. Lee already spoke about, the importance of partnerships, and something that has come up throughout our conference today thus far in different panels. And so the question for you, Mr. Lee, in a similar vein, is you talked about the 3 threats that you identify as most critical in the Atlantic Basin. What are some examples, especially in your last tour as the principal advisor at the National Maritime Integration Office, what are some of the anecdotal examples of success, especially those that involve partners, but across the board? What are some examples of success that you've seen or participated in regarding our efforts to combat those threats, those 3 threats you identified?
Certainly, Steve. First, on my one slide, I talked about awareness, and I just want to talk about that and emphasize that during my 8 years at NIMEO, every issue required a large amount of policymaker engagement. This meant for me that I spent a lot of time alerting senior policymakers from 3 different administrations on the serious threats we face from climate change, illicit maritime activity, and great power competition within the maritime domain. And I can't emphasize enough that despite the fact that the United States is a maritime nation, a lot of policymakers kind of don't think about the maritime. And I happened to walk past this room when the Asia Pacific panel was going, and there were about 800 people stuffed in the room because that's the region that everybody's focused on. But the Atlantic Basin, and so I have noticed during my career that the Atlantic is also taken for granted, and it certainly shouldn't be, given the propensity of issues and threats that certainly the Admiral grapples with on a daily basis, and the rest of us have focused on. And I'll give you an example of awareness. Back in 2014, I was new in the job. My boss and I worked for a 2-star admiral. We went and briefed some senior policymakers. I won't mention any names, even though I'm a elderly pensioner now. I don't want to show up on YouTube with any name dropping. But we went to talk about issues of critical issues within the maritime domain. We had about 4 or 5 key things. And when we got to IUUF, an acronym that nobody knew at the time, illegal unregulated fishing, I actually refer to it as evil fishing because it's the worst acronym. IUUF is the worst acronym, but evil fishing that Bob Sharp, one of my bosses, invented. So I like to go with that. But when we got to that, what my boss and I thought was going to be a very normal interaction turned into a very contentious session, much to our surprise. And I had a senior policymaker stare me in the face and said, "You mean you want me to worry about dead fish after all the other bleepity-bleep stuff I have to deal with?" And I was naturally taken aback by that. Again, it was 2014, okay? But fortunately, we had some very detailed, classified reasons why there are national security implications regarding IUUF, both for the United States and for our allies, and also, as we've come to find out, as the Admiral mentioned when he talked about China's distant water fishing fleets why it's an important issue. Now, I think as you all know, IUUF is at the forefront of so many policymakers' discussions. I mean, there are whole parts of the federal government and allies that are focused just on that issue. So in terms of awareness success, I always like to talk about that particular issue. I want to also talk about communications with industry. We led the revision of the U.S. Maritime Advisory System in 2016 that provided a streamlined approach for the U.S. government to communicate with the U.S. maritime industry regarding potential maritime threats through a single coordinated U.S. maritime advisory for issuing U.S. maritime alerts and advisories. An example of where that really helped was March of 2020, when the horrible COVID pandemic really kicked off in this country. It upended a lot of industries, but we were involved with the cruise line industry, and working through our alerts and advisory system, we were the clearinghouse for the entire U.S. government to help the cruise line industry manage that chaotic process. And I'll tell you, there was a lot of issues in terms of getting passengers off of ships, getting sick passengers quarantined, removing passengers who had passed away, doing as much as we could to mitigate. And believe me, we had a lot of Congress persons who had their people, their citizens on these ships or were focused on the cruise line industry. So having that communication system was critical. Another success is ocean policy coordination. In 2018, the Ocean Policy Committee, or OPC, was established, and the OPC, if you don't know, is a cabinet-level interagency body mandated by Congress to coordinate ocean science and technology and ocean management across federal agencies. I was the IC principal to the OPC. They're doing outstanding work. One area, and my second slide had talked about the US EEZ mapping. There is a national strategy for ocean mapping, exploration and characterization. You can find that on the internet. I would encourage private industry to look at how perhaps they can support that effort, because currently only 48% of the US EEZ is mapped, and this has real implications not only for combating climate change, but also as an economic imperative when you think about the rare earth mineral issue that we're going to be facing, particularly given Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The last thing I want to mention, because I warned Steve I was going to be the most verbose under the successes. I have a lot of examples here. But funding for maritime infrastructure security. This was a big effort in my office, and through coordinated efforts in the 2020 National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan, we successfully advocated for funding to expand existing and advanced developmental cyber intrusion, radio frequency interference characterization, and counterintelligence detection hardware and software into maritime critical infrastructure. I'm sorry, I lied. I have one more I want to highlight, and that's climate. In 2021, I hope you all know this, I'm sure you do, the Department of Defense, of all agencies, released its climate risk assessment, a very, very important document. And this discussed the risks of climate change on DoD strategies, plans, capabilities, missions, and equipment, as well as those of US allies and partners. It also talked about global efforts to address climate change, including actions to address the causes as well as the effects, which will influence DoD's strategic interests, relationships, competition, and priorities. My selfish interest, among others, regarding this from a maritime standpoint is, as the Admiral knows, there's a lot of US military and Department of Homeland Security facilities that will be impacted by climate change, by simply the rise in the level of the sea over the next few years. So we have to figure out how we can mitigate those so the critical infrastructure is not underwater within the broad area of the Atlantic Basin. So with that, I will turn the mic over. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. Having too many successes to talk about is never a problem. And let's hope we have more such problems in future panels. I'd like to shift now from that 30,000-foot level and talking about the overview of some of these issues to our first kind of deep dive topic being the role of emerging technologies writ large. And Mr. Gardner's well positioned to spark that discussion for us. And so my question, Mr. Gardner, for you, obviously the Navy, the Coast Guard, and DoD as a whole recognizes the critical importance of new emerging technologies, the threat that poses or challenge that poses when employed by potential adversaries, but specifically with unmanned autonomous vehicles, whether surface, subsurface, or aviation. In fact, the Navy in March 2021 released its unmanned campaign framework, and in that document, the Navy highlighted the need for, quote, affordable, lethal, scalable, and connected capabilities. Now, your opening remarks highlighted incredible advances that we're on the cusp of in unmanned aviation that could address many of the threats and challenges that Vice Admiral Poulin and Mr. Lee just identified. My question for you is, could you go into more detail about some of the challenges, some of the obstacles in implementing and taking where you are now, and not necessarily for Skydweller exclusively, but in the industry writ large, and taking these ideas and these prototypes and implementing them? What are some of the challenges to overcome key maritime domain awareness obstacles? What is your ability to reduce operating costs and sharing of information? What do you see as ways of overcoming these obstacles?
Yeah, so I find it interesting that in that document, the first word is not lethal, it's affordable. I don't know if that was meant on purpose, but I read it that way. And I read it that way because I see affordability as being the way to achieve effectiveness. I'll give you an example. So in AFRICOM, we hear a lot from AFRICOM about the tyranny of distance. And certainly that plays out across the oceans of the world too, right? You have the narco submarine, semi-submersible Che traveled through the Amazon and then 3,700 miles across the Atlantic until it ultimately arrived in Spain. That is a huge area, great distances. So where does that, and in order to solve this mission, airborne intelligence is critical because it provides enough broad area coverage at high enough fidelity that you can't get from space, you can't get from surface. So it's unique. And GIAF South found that when they have airborne ISR, their probability of interdiction goes up by 8 to 10 times. So it is critical, but how do you do it at distance, the tyranny of the distance? And so I wish I could graph something here, but you can imagine that if you have an aircraft that has 10 hours of endurance, if you want to provide persistence over an area, well, you might need 2 aircraft, right, to rotate. If you go out from your airbase 200 miles, you now need 3 aircraft in rotation to maintain persistence. You got another 100 miles, now you need 4. You go out another 100 miles to 400, you now need 7 aircraft to maintain persistence over an area. You go out to 450, now you need 13 aircraft. You go to 500, you need an infinite amount of aircraft. So there's this exponential curve that goes up with distance. And so the problem there is, therein lies how you mathematically capture this tyranny of distance. So can we break that cost curve? Because if we can, then we no longer follow an exponential cost escalation with range, and we don't have to set up forward operating bases everywhere in the world. We've broken the curve. And that's kind of the key ingredient that is sparking our interest to say, hey, what if you could now have an aircraft with unlimited endurance? You've now fundamentally broken that cost curve, and now you don't need 13 aircraft to maintain persistence. You just need 1. And then if you can bring the cost of that aircraft down, and you can make it autonomous, and you can give management of multiple assets to a few number of people, you brought the labor cost down, Now it's a technology that is hyper effective from a cost standpoint. It provides all the broad area coverage and persistence and fidelity that's required, and it becomes an accessible technology to partners. So that's kind of the way we capture that problem and how we address the solution.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner. Always, it's a moment of some concern and trepidation when an engineer says they want to start showing us graphs. But Mr. Gardner, exceptionally here, did so in a way that actually made everything clearer for us. So thank you. And I'd like to follow up on that with Vice Admiral Poulin and say, sir, how do you see these types of technologies, specifically unmanned aviation, but perhaps more broadly, being integrated with the Coast Guard mission set in the Atlantic Basin? How do you see that happening in, the next 5-year timeframe? And more to current issues today, how do you see that reflected in the president's proposed budget? Are you happy with that? Or what changes would you like to see in subsequent fiscal years?
I don't think any agency is satisfied with the pace of technological innovation. So I think we have to remain impatient. But I have seen us move from an analog Coast Guard to a digital Coast Guard, just in my time in service. And I think we're on the cutting edge of some incredible technologies. And for me, as an operational commander, leveraging technology is about enabling better operational success. Operations that are safer, more efficient, and done more intelligently. And so I think we have to leverage across the spectrum. Yes, I absolutely. A UAS and maritime patrol aircraft are absolutely a game changer when it comes to tactical cueing and targeting. But it just doesn't end there. It's about data integration, it's about data analytics, it's about having decision advantage. And those collection tools, whether it's MPA, whether it's UAS, we call it UXS, because we don't know what the X is as we continue to think about what the future looks like for the Coast Guard. So it's about that, but it's also about putting enhanced technological tools in the hands of our young Coast Guard men and women who daily go into harm's way. We need to make sure that we have connectivity for our cutters and our forward deployed forces. We need to make sure that they have the mobile capability and have the reach back. We have to make sure that they have the communications and that linkage back to appropriate command and control. I think of the Arctic, and I think of some of the challenges that we have in the Arctic as just one small example of communication challenges in the high latitudes. So to me, leveraging technology is the way we continue to have decision advantage and maintain an operational edge for the Coast Guard. I'm excited about the future. And here's the good news. We've got some bright young Coast Guard men and women who understand technology much better than me. And we got some smart people looking hard at how we move the needle, not just, I think, evolutionary, but even revolutionary as we advance a more technologically savvy Coast Guard.
That's great. Thank you very much, Admiral Poulin. And certainly much to be excited about when we see the younger generation putting on the uniform, whether or as civilian members of the Department of Defense moving forward. For the sake of time, and so that we can make sure we leave 10 minutes at the end for all of you, or those of you who are interested to engage with some questions, we're going to shift somewhat abruptly over to IUU fishing with Mr. Lee. That said, if you would like to double back and look at some of these issues, please feel free. But I was struck when you mentioned back in 2014, sitting in a room and said, people said, "You want me to worry about dead fish?" And fortunately, yes, many of you are here today perhaps because you are interested in Admiral Sharp's term, evil fish or IUU fishing, and that is a good thing. Public awareness has increased. But for those of you who are not aware, this is a problem that affects more than maritime security. The IUU fishing for any region, but especially in the Gulf of Guinea and West Africa, presents a critical problem. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the sardinella population, a small fish that is critical for protein sources for the population in West Africa, has diminished by 80%, 80, between 1996 and 2016. More broadly, UNFAO says that 43% of stocks in the eastern central Atlantic are believed to be fished at biologically unsustainable levels. So it's not only about maritime governance, an issue that matters to all of us here, but also about the knock-on effects, what's happening ashore and how that affects broader security issues. So one of the questions I'd like to have for you is, having worked at NIMI on these issues now for 8 years and seen it, how have you seen the US government approach change? You already mentioned partnerships, but what else has changed, and specifically with intelligence sharing, an issue that has come up in various parts of the panel thus far. How have we seen intelligence sharing with states that have much more limited capacity, much less robust infrastructure? How has that changed to take this from being lofty rhetoric and actually being implemented in a way that can achieve change?
Certainly. So as I mentioned with my dead fish example, that I've seen tremendous evolution on the topic of evil fishing. It's now at the forefront of our national security discussions. There are probably daily articles talking about China's distant water fishing fleets. And if any of you have worked the persistent PRC problem, the last thing they want is publicity. And so this is a good thing to particularly private industry helping the U.S. government and the our foreign partners to advertise what the Chinese are doing around the globe. But in terms of your question, Steve, another key organization that I was the IC principal for was the Maritime Security and Fisheries Enforcement Act, or the Maritime Safe Act. That's an acronym I think is pretty cool, actually, Safe Act. And it became law in December of 2019. This law set up an interagency working group on IUF. It's co-chaired by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the Coast Guard, and also the Department of State. Those are the three co-chairs. But it has membership from throughout the federal interagency. And I represented Director Haynes from ODNI and was able to leverage the broad intel community capabilities to support what this interagency working group was trying to accomplish, and also to help CG2 and the great work that the Coast Guard is doing from an operational standpoint against evil fishing capabilities. Now, if you aren't familiar, the overarching purpose of the Maritime Safe Act was to support a whole of government approach across the federal government to counter IUF and related threats to maritime security, and it seeks to achieve these through several things. One is improving data sharing that enhances surveillance, enforcement, and prosecution against IUF and related activities, support the coordination and collaboration to counter IUF within priority regions, and the Admiral mentioned some key priority regions in his opening remarks. Also to increase and improve global transparency and traceability across the seafood supply chain to deter IUF and strengthen fisheries management and food security. And that's important because it allows us to bring in other means to go after this problem. You go after the money, you go after the companies, and certainly there are a lot of IC agencies that have the capabilities to bore into the companies that are funding these illicit activities and try and strangle them from that aspect. So a way to complement what the Coast Guard is doing on the high seas. And finally, it's to improve global enforcement and prevent the use of IUU fishing as a financing source for transnational organized crime groups. Again, something the Admiral highlighted that is a big concern, because once you start doing that, it opens the door for a lot of other illicit activities. So I'll stop there, Steve. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner. And again, for the audience, hopefully these are stimulating some thoughts for you to follow up on momentarily. I am going to shift abruptly again, just to kind of open the floor and broach some topics for that discussion, and give our final question before the Q&A to Mr. Gardner as we shift to the topic of strategic competition. And I give the final question here to Mr. Gardner because I think there's natural questions many of you will hopefully ask to Vice Admiral Poulin or Mr. Lee about their thoughts on global power competition, great power competition, strategic competition, whatever the phrase of the year is. But I think Mr. Gardner brings a unique perspective from private industry on this as well. And so my question for you, Mr. Gardner, is how does the increasingly tense environment, even before the events of February of this year, the increasingly competitive environment, whether that is vis-a-vis China or Russia, how does that affect your planning in private industry, the way you build prototypes and plan, and your marketing, your future marketing? I'm thinking specifically with expanded export controls, restrictions on trade that you need to keep in mind. How does that affect your long-term planning as a startup in this sector?
Well, I think it goes beyond even recent events. For us, a lot of us have experience building unmanned systems and selling those internationally, and it's extraordinarily difficult, and we learned a lot of lessons through that experience. And it's interesting because on all fronts, on the US government side and on the partner side, nobody wanted that friction. So what we've done in our organization, we set it up from the very beginning to be an international organization where things like the core technology is built outside of an ITAR fence. That required multiple years of work with the Commerce Department to get the proper licenses and set that up. I don't know if really any other organization's ever gone to that length to set that up, but that's important because we knew that to have the maximum impact, we had to have a system that was accessible by partner nations. And not just a US government asset, not just the US government having the best technology, but to make it affordable and accessible to these partner nations. I mean, you look at Jihad of South, there's 16 US agencies and 20 partner nations coming together to do amazing work. And those countries have incredible will and bravery in supporting that mission set. And if we could get that capability in the arms of Central and South American countries, in African countries, and then also make it cost justifiable by connecting in with commercial endeavors as well, like telecommunications, and bringing a multifaceted approach to solving it financially, then it becomes a viable solution for even the poorest countries.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Gardner, shedding some light on how some of those constraints from the ITAR, if you're not familiar, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations put out by the Department of Commerce. Department of State also has a role in these types of export controls and how they have to plan around that to make sure they are not running afoul of some of our restrictions in place for international trade in this environment of great power competition. So I think that's very illuminating and hopefully catalyzes some follow-on questions from you, our audience. So we have time. We have the microphone front and center here and would welcome any and all to come up, please. Just state your name and direct to any of our three panelists your question.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I think this has been a very interesting panel with a lot of food for thought. And there's been a lot of talk about partnerships. And of course, one of the difficulties of partnerships, which you alluded to when you talked about setting up the maritime security advisories and alert systems, is getting everybody to work together. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the challenges that have had to be overcome to have better integration and a whole of government approach. And also, how can we overcome those challenges in terms of being able to better integrate with our partners in the region to achieve some of these goals? Because I think one of the difficulties is that there is a lot of stovepipes, not just in terms of partners, but also within our own government and within agencies themselves. Thank you.
Mr. Lee, would you like to take the Vice Admiral Pullen?
Sure. I always like to answer a question from Doris, so. Because you always ask tough questions, but now that I'm retired, I can give you the honest answer here. So I got to say, the number one issue that I grappled with and I felt that I didn't succeed in the most was achieving unclassified data sharing amongst the vast number of partners that needed it. And I think if there's one area that I would plead with private industry to help the US government is that come up with a way to achieve easy, um, uh, an easy, affordable way to provide unclassified data. Because too many times, to your point, there would be a stovepipe approach, and oh, sure, you can have this data, but you have to buy our black box, and oh, our black box needs special cables to work with this agency's black box. And it would just be a constant bureaucratic battle just to achieve that. It was very easy on the classified side because there are less players, and there were fewer agencies that controlled those black boxes and that information. But for me to get the same data to state and local fusion centers, to the Coast Guard, to the FBI, to the government to the Coast Guard in Brazil, you name it. It was just incredibly difficult and very frustrating. But
I think it starts by building trust. You have to start with trust with international partners. That's the first step. And then I think we all too often try and arrange an architecture based on where we think our partners should be, not where they're actually at. I think we need to build that architecture, understanding where the partners are at, whether it's legal limitations, technological limitations, whether it's command and control limitations, whatever it is. So I think we have to meet the partners where they're at. And then as we build it and as we mature it, I think it grows exponentially. And I've seen that happen in many, many situations. But I think it starts with trust, then building the right architecture that fits a particular partner. And then I think the other area where we've had a lot of success is building it from a multinational perspective. There are things where we want to work bilaterally. Those are important. We need to have those mechanisms. But there are other areas where I think we benefit from establishing an architecture that's multinational. I'll give you one example, Doris. We're about to sign out an Eastern Caribbean campaign plan from one of my positions as Director of Joint Task Force East. We wanted to do that from a regional perspective, not necessarily working with one particular country, not focused on one particular threat stream, but taking a more holistic approach to how we manage and share information. But again, it all has to have that trust as the underpinning. I'm a big fan on getting to yes foreign instead of no foreign.
I like that. Mr. Gardner, would you like to take a quick stab at that?
I guess the thing that comes to my mind is from a top level perspective, when we think about these challenges of illicit trafficking and evil fishing, it's not about how do you make these activities impossible to do, because you never will. So you're not making it impossible to do, you're trying to make it economically unviable for them to do it. So it's not just a matter of how do we stop them from doing this activity, it's where can we apply pressure that increases their expense side of their profit and loss statement. And if we can just get their expense side to increase enough, it becomes no longer viable. And so each of these partner nations can play a role maybe in different ways to how can you cause the adversary to increase their expenses and bankrupt them. Because at that point, it stops when it becomes no longer economically viable. Or reduce the revenue side. Can you reduce the demand or can you increase expenses?
Thank you very much. What I'd ask, if I know there are two more questions, and maybe I could have you both go consecutively and just spit them out up here, and we can do our best to get them out.
My question was already answered.
Fantastic. Sarah, then the microphone is yours.
Great. And a great lead in to my question. So thank you. Cesar Morales with S&P Global Market Intelligence. We talked about economic prowess. We talked about trade. And we talked about how the undercurrent of the maritime domain is driven, especially the pattern of life, by economics. So my question is, what role does trade and commodity data play at the operational and tactical level when it comes to MDA analysis?
I'll start. I'll jump in here. I think it's absolutely critical. We've got to get a better handle on pattern of life when it comes to maritime trends. I think we have too often lagged behind what those trends are, and we find ourselves playing catch up. So if we can have a process and the right kind of machine learning, data analytics that will allow us to stay on the cutting edge, again, this goes back to the decision advantage that I talked about, and we can be more predictive instead of reactionary. I think that gives us, that puts us where I want to be as an operational commander. It's about being able to not only see trends, but predict trends. And that's going to be data driven.
Yes, sir, please, yeah. And then Mr. Lee, if you want to, we'll get this question out, and then if you want to comment on that as well, we can kind of bundle them together.
Kevin Lopes, Thayer Mahan. We do long duration, long dwell, persistent surveillance, although we use acoustics to do it. We have a full stack, right? So we can bring back the data, do all the analytics. And I guess that gets to the heart of my question. Some of this stuff is very expensive, the equipment and the people to do the analytics. How open is the government in particular to outsourcing the decision space, as you put it, Admiral, and being able to fund things like this? You know, are there funding contract vehicles that are structured in a way that you can pay for data or decision space as a service instead of paying for the tech or the particular sensor? Thank you.
Mr. Lee, would you like to look at that first?
Thank you for that. There are contract mechanisms, and I know there have been, really in the last 5 years, a lot more private sector data-driven contracts that have helped on these areas.
I'd say, you know, there can be a reluctance on industry as well to more openly share information that they collect because of the proprietary nature of it. So I think there's a two-way street here that we've got to really look at. I'm not sure we can outsource decision, because I think there are certain inherently governmental functions that have to reside with the federal government. One, we're statutorily empowered to make the decisions. But I think, you know, to your point, Kevin, we can be much more collaborative with industry and figuring out what the realm of the possible is. I think too often we have a standoffish relationship. I think it's got to be a more collaborative relationship. Obviously, we understand the ethical and the acquisition restrictions that attend to that. But I think we can have better collaboration with industry. You guys can make us smarter, and we can make you smarter as well.
Mr. Gardner, do you have any thoughts? Or,
you know, I think there is growing interest in all the discussions that we've had as we've visited different combatant commands and different ministries around the world. We get this asked all the time. Hey, can you just not sell us the airplane? Can you just provide us a service? It happens all the time. And there is definitely a growing interest in doing that. Where that boundary lies is going to be a big decision to make. But I'm with the Admiral here. If you're talking about decision regarding interdictions or some of these decisions, you can't. That's an inherently governmental function. But as far as operating an aircraft or a different kind of a vehicle and providing intelligence information and processed and exploited and all that, providing information to the decision maker, there's probably a lot that can be done there. But what it requires from industry is a very specific business model. And this is where, you know, a lot of companies aren't set up like that. When you're in the DoD space, you're set up to go after contracts, and you're going to do cost plus fixed fee development, and you have zero risk. The moment that you take on, I'm going to provide a service, you now have to go out and get big investment, and you have to build capital, and you may have to go get debt, and you may go get contracts that aren't going to guarantee that that's all going to get paid off. That's a whole level of business risk that is not, most companies in the DoD or in this space are not accustomed to, and they don't desire that model. But so it takes certain kind of companies that are like, we will embrace this model. we are willing to take the risk. We'll work with the financial institutions and the insurance companies and put together a business model that can make this work. But it's a different kind of model. But we've understood that from the beginning, so we had to set up the company specifically for that. But most companies aren't really set up to do that. And their shareholders and the way it works, they're not wanting to take that risk. So it will take a change.
Thank you very much. I suspect there may be some follow-on questions as people see each other after this talk and through the hallways, the passageways, if we're in a maritime environment here, in the coming days. But a huge thanks to our three panelists today, and also to all of you for being here.